Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. What if Deku was a ghoul? I hope you enjoy. I did not write this story. This story was written by Just Low. Let's dive in. The sun had long since set, lights in the top floor apartment a clear indication of someone being home. So why the occupant doesn't respond to Himiko Toga's shrill shout of his name, Aka Ataya Nii, as drawn out as it may be, still remains a wonder to her. The blonde raps her knuckles against the door, not for the first time, as she leans an ear to it. Despite receiving no response after yet another failure, she remains firmly planted at the welcome mat. Her next whine isn't any less indignant, "Come on, I know you're home." Only when she follows it with a threat, "Don't make me bust the door down," does she finally get a response. It's open. Akatani speaks at a much lower decibel, making the girl's straining worthwhile. Himiko balks at the revelation. Really? Before actually trying the knob. When it turns and the door swings open, she shakes her head in further exaggerated disbelief. That's not a good way to prevent robberies, you know. She shuts the door behind her as though to emphasize her point. Akatani doesn't play along, his energy dwindled to the point of non-existence. He sprawled across his couch in a pair of black shorts and a white t-shirt, one arm hanging loosely over the side that his hand touches the floor. His voice still low enough to be a whisper. "What are you doing here, Himiko?" He lazily drawls a question. Though admittedly surprised by the boy's attitude, Himiko isn't wavered by it. She has a pep in the steps that carry her over to his bedside. "I went to Antiku to surprise you, but your boss said you called in sick today." She then hoists up a shopping bag that Akatani had failed to notice earlier. "So I brought you some medicine." Himiko pauses, seemingly noticing the drugs she bought the same time he does. Before he can even get the chance to sit up and sift through the bag's contents himself, she's already doing her own rummaging. "Oh, wait. Does medicine taste bad to you too?" She recalls the side effect of the ghoul's quirk as she searches for something to give him. It tastes bad for everyone anyways." Taking the bag from her, Akatani sets it on the floor in a particular spot where nobody will trip over it. "I'm not sick. That was just an excuse to not have to work." He finally raises his voice to a normal frequency so he can quell any concerns for his health. "Huh? That isn't like you." Himiko tilts her head in confusion. She hadn't expected that of him. She just as quickly dismisses the lie to his boss though, concern shifted to other matters. "You owe me 800 yen then." She gestures to the medicine she bought before glancing around the apartment. "Where's Eri?" Reminded of the real reason for his sudden reclusiveness, Akatani plops back down onto the cushioning of his couch. He may as well rip it off like a band-aid and tell it to her straight, he figures. "The heroes and police found me." He closes his eyes in anticipation of what he's sure will be a rambunctious response. "You let them take her?" His expectations are met when Himiko shouts incredulously at him. It didn't take her long to connect the dots and realize the reason for Eri's absence based on the bomb he dropped. He really doesn't want to deal with this right now. He's already trying to process what happened himself and his own emotions. He heaves out a heavy sigh, sinking deeper into the couch, hoping that it'll swallow him up. When it doesn't, he forces himself to open his eyes in order to fix Himiko with a hard stare. What else was I supposed to do? He genuinely wants to know what other choice he had in the matter. Himiko throws her hands up in the air. Whether the gesture be because she feels the answer is obvious or that she herself doesn't know is only unclear for a mere moment. "Fight them. Rip them apart. Something." Her suggestions fly out with swipes of her hands that make her spiral and fall on the couch beside Akatani. He shakes his head with what minimal energy he can muster. It was a hero. Not the Yakuza. "What's the difference so long as they're trying to take Eri from you?" Himiko crosses her arms under her small bust as she challenges Akatani on his excuse. He glances up at her in disbelief, taken aback by the sincerity in her tone. He'd forgotten about this side to her. Himiko had proven a few times that she can be a bit intense. He just hadn't expected her to suggest he kill heroes on top of criminals. He was certain that they agreed a line must be drawn somewhere. The difference is that the Yakuza wanted to hurt Eri. This hero wants to help. He assumes that she's just being protective of the little girl. But when he sees the same sincerity in her eyes as she says, "Akatani, you should know by now that heroes don't want to help people like us," he knows it's more than having an attachment to Eri. For her, it's personal. Akatani's brows furrow, his frustration leaking into his expression. It's not like he doesn't care about Eri too. It's just that he trusts heroes a little more than she does. Deep down inside, he's still a hero otaku. Plus, he had a fair amount of time to get acquainted with Eraserhead. This one is different. I can tell, he knows not all heroes are like All Might, good or bad as that comparison may be. Himiko huffs, still not taking him seriously. Does your quirk make you psychic too now? Her sarcastic remark has Akatani sitting up to address her on a more personal level. Wanting to be taken seriously and for his word to hold some merit, Akatani recalls the incident more vividly. He could have erased my quirk, Himiko. A SWAT team could have shot me full of tranquilizers, or a team of heroes could have overpowered me before I even knew what happened. They had the element of surprise. The hardness in his tone is its own sincerity. Hearing how easily he could have been captured, Himiko lowers her guard a little. Her eyes soften and she uncrosses her arms, thinking about how close of a call Akatani being cornered truly was. So why didn't they? Her voice wobbles as it sways between anger and sorrow. Seeing how difficult it is for her to process the news, Akatani takes Himiko's hand in his own as an attempt to comfort her. He wanted to talk to me first. He wanted to give me a chance. He gives her hand a soft squeeze to let her know he's still there for her. If that's not a real hero, then I don't know what is. Himiko looks as though she wants to say more, continue trying to dispute the decision to hand Eri over, but refrains. Instead, she admits defeat as well. Her shoulders drop and her head hangs. So that's it? You're just giving up? Seeing the fight drain from her system, Akatani allows his own to fade. Like I said, a hero has her. She's in good hands. Probably better than mine. His gaze falls to he and Himiko's intertwined fingers. Why are you so opposed? Himiko stares off into the distance, looking at nothing nor no one in particular. Heroes take away the things I want. When her eyes return to Akatani, he lifts his head to meet them, the things that I love. The boy blushes at the slight confession, but forces himself to maintain eye contact as she continues speaking. They took Eri away. And they almost took you too. Love, Akatani nearly chokes on the word. He pulls away and coughs into the hand that he was using to hold Himiko's. Whatever. They let me off the hook. Sorta. He shakes his head to clear away any romantic thoughts and returns the conversation to its original point of origin. My point is that you don't have to worry about them locking me up, and Eri is just as free. Himiko blinks in reaction to his reaction. Having already had one intense conversation for the day though, she decides to save that one for another time. What do I need to worry about then? She sighs while standing up. You're going to make me stress eat. She travels from the couch to the kitchen while asking, you still have food in your fridge? Though the topic of discussion is no longer about heroes, Akatani isn't quite able to forget about Eri. After all, she's the only reason why the place is stocked with ordinary food. And the cabinets. Help yourself. He falls back onto the couch with just as heavy a heart as he had when Himiko first intruded. Himiko raids the fridge while saying, I'm no hero, but I want to help you, Akatani. And returns with a bright red apple. Eri es favorite. If the heroes can take Eri, then let me take you away. Yeah, she takes a bite from the fruit once she arrives back at the couch. Having already exhausted what energy he could muster to argue with her, he isn't prepared for what the blonde has up her sleeve now. Akatani lulls his head to the side, eyelids drooping just as much. What do you mean? There's a glimmer in the blonde's eye that wakes Akatani back up. Instead of laying around here sulking all day, let's go on a date. She holds out her free hand for him to take. Akatani pauses just as he's about to grab it. A date? He'd like to blame his short-circuited brain on being drowsy, considering they'd already been on one before according to her. Himiko finishes the reach for him and takes his hand in hers. Yeah. It'll cheer you up. I don't know, but the boy is still much too reluctant to move just yet. Himiko tugs on his arm, trying to get him to budge. Come on. It'll be fun, but to no avail. Only when the blonde resorts to violence by throwing her apple at his head does he give in. All right, fine, he groans like an old man with weak knees as he stands up to go. But of course, their date night is that of two teens. They're young and full of vigor. Nor are they ordinary. Roaming rooftops brings them closer to the stars. Spring in their step carries them from building to building. Akatani's mask warms his face when the cool breeze brushes through his hair. The type of thrill that they get from this above-average form of parkour is greater than any simple type of outing. There's nothing quite like a hunt to a predator. Even if Akatani is no longer allowed to eat his quarry, there's something about the actual action of instinct. When they come across a purse snatcher who's completely oblivious to their stalking, there's no comparison to that kind of euphoria. The ghoul drops from above, tentacles wrapping the prey using powerful suctions, momentum of the strike throwing coils around the victim's body. The red limbs constrict, going for a quick suffocation. They squeeze. Every time the prey exhales, they squeeze a little more tightly. Himiko doesn't even get a chance to do anything herself. She draws back and watches as Akatani handles the purse snatcher himself. Normally, she'd be content with doing so. It's enticing to her to watch the ghoul hunt. However, this is notably different from those other times. He's not enjoying it himself. Not truly. There's something smaller than the red speck in his Kakugan which spurs him on. Akatani always hunts with aggression. The release of rage is always evident. Except, there's no burst of agony this time. Blood doesn't spill and none of that sorrow is shed. He nearly rips the purse snatcher apart, but he stops himself. He holds back for the sake of the promise he made to erase her head. The thief is rendered unconscious instead, let off easy. Acts of vigilantism, regardless of restraint, is sure to still cause him trouble. And yet, it's not even worth it to him. As he leaps from roof to roof with Himiko in search of another criminal to vent through, he feels just as empty as he did when leaving his apartment. Himiko spends the rest of the night in a similar state of unrest. She studies Akatani rather than joining in, no longer having any fun either. However, there's no knowing what the ghoul's face looks like as he does all this. There's no telling what sort of sad expression he's making. Nobody knows when he has a mask to hide it. Antiku's wooden floor had aged, its boards creaking under the pressure of every step. Even though it's just another ruthless day at the coffee shop, Akatani can't help but feel although he's being trampled upon just the same. The passing customers don't demand much, just for him to pour coffee from a silver pot into their blue onion flower cups arrayed at each table. Yet, the tin feels heavy enough in his hand to be a dumbbell. The young barista absent-mindedly places a dessert plate decorated with a caramel flan on one of the tables. He'd normally be anxious under the anticipation of waiting on Eraserhead given ordinary circumstances, but his excursion last night has him extra stressed. If the underground hero found out he's still operating as a vigilante, regardless of restraint, he worries that he'd really no longer be able to see Eri. Every time the door chime indicates another customer, Akatani's head swivels to see if it's the little girl and her new guardian. He instead notices what's playing inaudibly from a television mounted above the checkout counter. It's across the way from where the boy is currently standing so that he can see it at the perfect angle. What's being shown has him just as entranced as he was with his own thoughts. The morning news covers a story about Japan's most prestigious hero school. Apparently, the Udata barrier was destroyed. Or rather, it was disintegrated. Already, Akatani speculates the reasons and possibilities as to how or why. It had recently been announced that All Might began teaching there. A reporter or member of the paparazzi could have simply wanted to get a big scoop. However, there's always the concern of more sinister motives. Before the boy can get too lost in thought, his mind is returned to its original focus. The door chime alerts him to their arrival before he hears Eri's gleeful, "Akata and I." That's the only warning he gets before a little blur covers the span of the cafe to slam straight into his legs. Overwhelmed with an equally delighted emotion, Akatani can't help but laugh with somewhat relative relief. It's from an awkward angle that he has to bend down at the waist, but he happily returns the little girl's hug. "I missed you too, Eri." The smile on his face is genuine as he takes in her presence. As though they'll take her away from him again, he lifts his head to check on the others that came through the door. Aizawa isn't alone. Accompanying him is the detective, Naomasa. Akatani eyes them for a moment, lowering his voice for Eri alone. "Have they been treating you well?" When he feels Eri nod against his legs, the rest of him loosens. The tense tightening of his shoulders lets them drop a little. Whether it's because the detective heard or saw Akatani's concern for the girl, nobody can be sure. It's his job to be perceptive. Naomasa tries to reassure the boy with a smile. She's in good hands, it's the best attempt at comfort that he can offer. But Akatani isn't in the best of moods to perceive it as an attempt of peace. "I didn't ask you." His words have a bite to them that reminds the detective of how animalistic the boy can be. That the young barista isn't an average teenager. He's the tokyoghoul. Aizawa takes a step forward, the foot meant to be put in between the two opposing sides of law each one represents. She's safe. His assurances seem to reach Akatani instead of the detective's. Suddenly, it's a reminder that he is the one caring for Eri and not Naomasa, putting Akatani at ease. "You can trust us." Aizawa's eyes meet the boy's to let him know that he's sincere. Akatani holds Eri closer to him anyways. Having her there in his arms helps to calm his nerves, but he still can't help but shake his worries. Not after what the television showed. The Udata barrier. I saw on the news. He starts to vocalize his concern but gets stopped short. Everything's under control. Aizawa is quick to allay Akatani's worry yet again. He sounds so sure of himself. Akatani remembers that the man is not just a pro hero, but a teacher at the hero school too. He's on the front lines in both potentially dangerous scenarios. But it's because of that lifestyle that Akatani is worried in the first place. Is it? She could have been hurt. He doesn't want to consider what would have happened if somebody malicious had broken into a place to hurt children. Aizawa's eyes narrow just the slightest bit. The slight glare makes Akatani realize how hypocritical he's being. It's not like his own vigilante lifestyle had given Eri the safest living environment. Uda's teacher's lounge is one of the safest and most secure places she can be. He makes a fair point that heroes are there to protect her as well. But Aizawa isn't looking him in the eye anymore. Naomasa looks over at the underground hero with a bit of surprise, then back at Akatani. The motion doesn't go unnoticed. The detective sighs before saying, "Come on, Aizawa. The kid doesn't need my quirk to know that was a lie." Aizawa's stare switches to Naomasa. "It wasn't." And that makes the detective pause momentarily. Naomasa waits a second before shaking it off. Then, he explains. The barrier being destroyed so that the paparazzi and reporters could get in wasn't an accident. We're investigating whether this deliverance was malicious or just for the sake of some lucky scoop on All Might, and Akatani is grateful for him not sugarcoating the truth at the very least. Aizawa hangs his head, ashamed for having hidden that truth from the boy who had entrusted Eri to him. Having it out in the open now, it was a declaration of war. A distraction. He shares his own outlook on it. Naomasa raises a brow in the underground hero's direction. "I thought taking care of a child would get you to drop your conspiracy theory hobby." "I don't think it's just a conspiracy. It did seem strange." Akatani defends Aizawa's reasoning with his own suspicions. Seeing the detective isn't quite as easily convinced, Aizawa elaborates. "In all the years Udade has prospered, has it ever once been infiltrated like today?" His question makes Naomasa swallow whatever retort had been on the tip of his tongue prior to that thought. The detective considers that factor. However, it's something that'll have to be mulled over in his office and not a coffee shop. Enough. This isn't something to be discussed in front of civilian children. He ends it there before he and Aizawa overshare something important about the investigation. Especially since, and I'm saying that lightly when not taking other components into account, Akatani has his own criminal record. He stares at the boy, not seeing a hint of ghoulish evil hidden in him. "No offense." Akatani shrugs impassively, none taken. Interjecting herself into the conversation now that it's essentially ended, "Akata and I," Eri tentatively looks up at the boy she's latched onto. His smile returning to put her at ease, Akatani looks down to meet her gaze. "Yeah," his voice is much softer with her than it was with the adults. But Eri still hesitates. She shyly looks away before requesting, "Can you tell Todoroki and Shinso-san I said hi?" Akatani's eyes widen briefly, surprised by the affectionate nicknames she had given their friends. It seems that he isn't the only one that she's missed seeing. His smile wobbles a bit as he holds back tears. "I sure can," and he ruffles her hair much to her dismay. Listening in, Aizawa's own eyes widen in shock as well. He recognizes the names of the boys Eri mentioned, one of which is a student in his class. He's not sure what their connection to the boy and girl is, but as curious as he is, he decides to let it go for now. The rest of Eri's visit to Antiku is a lot more enjoyable for her and Akatani. The mood takes a more light-hearted tone when Yoshimura joins in on the reunion. They enjoy each other's time and company, not taking any of it for granted. But sooner or later, it ends. Eri leaves with Aizawa and Akatani is left alone again. All he has after she's gone to remember her by is the promise he made to her. He goes to the quirk support group so that he can keep his word. As expected, the coffee machine in the hallway is where he runs into Shinso first. "I thought I'd find you here," he jokingly greets the fellow insomniac and coffee addict. Shinso steps aside so that Akatani can fish his own canned coffee from the vending machine. "I should be saying that to you." When Akatani's back is turned, Shinso allows a lazy smile to cross his face. "Long time, no see." Hearing Shinso, Akatani scratches the back of his head as though he'll be able to dig out a proper excuse for his absence. "I've been a bit busy," is all he manages to come up with. Shinso shrugs like he doesn't care, though he probably secretly does. It helps him to avoid being accused of having affection by blaming the other boy Akatani came to see. Todoroki barely comes around anymore either. I think he was a little disappointed that I was the only one showing up. Hearing that and remembering his last conversation with Todoroki, having promised to see him again during sessions here, Akatani feels a pang of guilt in his chest. I'm a terrible friend, aren't I? His body sinks with his sulking voice by literally sinking. But a better brother. Shinso tries to cheer him up, not knowing better of Akatani's current situation. Speaking of which, where is Eri? She's normally attached to your leg. He glances around in search for the little girl. Akatani's demeanor doesn't quite change aside from mild fidgeting as he searches for a proper response. Oh. He eventually lands on, her dad wanted to see her, a technical half-lie considering Aizawa had to adopt her. He pulls from his own family history to make it a little more believably personal. He lives in America, so? Shinso solemnly nods as he takes in the lie, believing it. I get it. His consoling expression makes Akatani feel all the more guilty for withholding the truth. You probably already miss her, huh? Is it that obvious? But there's no need to lie about that. Well, Shinso hides his face with his canned coffee. Don't forget you have, friends that are here for you, taking a sip afterwards so Akatani can't see his blush. Taken aback by Shinso's rare show of affection, Akatani is startled into silence. He cracks open his own coffee before also taking a sip, sharing the boy's embarrassment. Anyways, Eri wanted me to tell you, before she left, that she said hi. He averts his eyes before adding, you and Todoroki go to U.A, right? Shinso lowers his coffee, stopping from taking another sip. Yeah. He's surprised by the question, but dismisses it just as quickly, except I'm in Gen Ed, remember? He presumes Akatani is just curious about the hero course. Never mind that. But Akatani surprises him yet again. Shinso waits to hear the rest, curious as to what this could be about. Be careful, he certainly wasn't expecting a warning. That's not ominous at all. Shinso raises a brow that gives him an expression oddly reminiscent of Aizawa. Akatani swallows despite having not taken another sip of coffee. The U.A barrier being destroyed, he hesitates before explaining his reason for concern. I don't think that it was coincidental. He pauses one last time before trying to smooth it over. I'm just saying to be cautious is all. Shinso continues to stare at Akatani. Skeptically. Perhaps even warily. Then he mumbles a, thanks, still not quite sure what the boy means. I don't know how or why you know that. His eyes meet Akatani's, but you be careful too. It started as a tapping. Little flicks against the glass shielding Akatani from the outside. As the sky darkened with storm clouds, however, the spears of water became thicker. Rain now rattles the windows as the droplets yell at him. He doesn't know if it's some sort of animalistic instinct, but it almost sounds as though nature is warning him. The world is trying to tell him something. Something that he would only know soaked by the cold touch of darkness and not hidden away in the warm comfort of Antiku. He remembers what it's like. Water running down his face like tears. His hair matted and damp. Clothes drenched. The blood pouring down on him like the rain, and the only difference between the two being one's cool sting versus the other's warm stick. Akatani shakes his head to clear away those thoughts. The urge to feel the liquid on his skin again still lingers. The desire to taste it. He runs his tongue along his chapped lips, suddenly aware of how dry they are. Akatani drinks some of the coffee that he's supposed to be selling, hoping that it'll be enough to quench his thirst. He hopes that the only reason he's parched is because of the monsoon right outside the cafe. The ghoul knows that's not the truth though. That's just an excuse. Akatani knows what's actually happening. He hasn't told Eraserhead. He's not quite sure he wants to even admit it to himself. The erasure meals aren't working. They do. For a while. However, it's a more temporary fix than previously presumed. There are two problems. The first is that he's not satisfied with regular food anymore. He had thought having his taste buds return to normal would be the best thing that could happen to him, but it's comparable to having vegetables when he could be enjoying a big slice of chocolate cake. His mouth has developed a craving for flesh. The second issue is a much more concerning matter. Akatani is fairly certain that the erasure has only been increasing his appetite for flesh and blood. Eating an average meal does satisfy his hunger just like any other person. However, just like any other person, he gets hungry again later. Except, it seems his hunger is tenfold. He no longer feels famished, but very much starved. He's been checking the clock during his shifts, and he's also willing to bet that the intervals in between meals before he gets hungry again has been drastically dropping in time. It went from losing minutes to hours. Akatani's nails dig into the counter like a set of claws, scratching at the wood. He feels like a caged animal. He's suddenly aware of how trapped he is. The pounding on the window is the wild stone jungle he'd familiarized himself with as a hunting ground. Now he waits for his meals to be brought to him and served. He impatiently growls, teeth gritted and grinding. Aizawa hadn't shown up for lunch. Which is annoying. Yet, he understands the man teaches at U.A during the day. It's excusable and understandable. What's as frustrating as it is equally concerning is that the underground hero should be able to manage bringing dinner during his night shift. Akatani checks the clock again. Eraserhead is running late. He's never late, and this is by far later than usual if there is such a thing as late. The rainstorm suddenly feels like a much worse omen than it previously did. If the ghoul really does have such a thing as instinct based on nature's weather, then that means something bad must have happened. Akatani starts mulling over the possibilities for Aizawa's tardiness. It could be something as simple as his duties being a teacher. Perhaps he had to hold a student after class or the principal called for a meeting. Maybe Eri needed tending to. Akatani would be forgiving of the man's tardiness if the reason is parenthood for his technically adopted sister. The worst outcome comes to mind as well though. There's a chance that something bad happened. Eraserhead is an underground hero who fights criminals and villains alike. Akatani's pupils contract. Red veins begin to stem from his eyes. He stares hard at nothing in particular, an angry glare he wishes he had something to fixate on. The pressure of his fingers pressing into the cashier counter start causing it to splinter, nails carving into the wooden structure. His heart beats in his chest like a drum, loud enough to be the thunder that the storm outside is missing. The ghoul begins to worry about the safety of the pro-hero who's taken Eri under his wing. If Aizawa is in danger, the protective older brother worries that his sister could be in trouble by extension. Akatani seethes through his teeth, biting back a feral shout that he wishes he could direct at whoever dares endanger Eri. The door chime brings Akatani back to reality, his mind reeling with his body as he jumps back. When he releases his grip on the counter, wood shavings fly up in the air with his hand. His pupils dilate until they're back to normal and the veins bulging from his eyes recede just as quickly. His flow of black hair whips to the side when he turns his head to see who entered the shop, the locks still covering one side of his face. He's surprised to see Naomasa instead of Aizawa, the detective's overcoat drenched from the monsoon. Judging by Naomasa's expression, the man is as equally disturbed as the boy. His rectangular eyes meet Akatani's, a solemn silence communicating what the boy already knows. Akatani would cry, but the storm is already shedding enough tears for him with its downpour of rain. Where's Eraserhead? Akatani asks the question anyways. Though he knows the answer. Though he doesn't want to hear it confirmed. In his mind, rationally, there would be no other reason for the detective to come see him instead. Naomasa looks off to the side, breaking eye contact. There was an incident, he begins. His words are slow. He's treading lightly, so as not to spook a wild animal. Akatani tenses anyways. The wet squelch of the detective's shoes on the floor alerts Akatani to the man's attempt at subtly moving closer. When Naomasa sees the boy flinch back, he stops. The next few seconds that pass aren't quite a standoff. However, there is tension radiating between the two. It makes Naomasa hesitate. He's never sure of himself when in the presence of the ghoul. He never knows how to interact with a boy who's also capable of creating the crime scenes he's seen. You don't have to come, but he's requesting to speak with you, but those words must be the right ones to have said. Akatani's visible eye widens, the green within glowing with childlike hopefulness. There's an unspoken stutter from the boy's end that he tries to cover up, but Naomasa notes it in his memory. When Akatani recovers, he speaks with a hardened resolve that doesn't quite make it to his gaze. Take me to him. Akatani had assumed the worst. The storm. Aizawa's absence. Naomasa's arrival. The unelaborated incident that the detective spoke of. It all pointed to another person leaving his life. Not just his, but Ares who needs the underground hero most. He sighs to nobody in particular, frustration and relief blending like gasoline and water. Now he's in a police cruiser headed for UA. Neither of the two locations did he ever think he'd be in, let alone for the reasons that he is and will be. His gaze falls to his lap, not quite sure of where to look in the vehicle and unwilling to stare at Detective Naomasa. But he is, at the very least, still willing to speak. He wants to know more about what happened, even if he's already conjured up his own resolution in his head. Does this have to do with the barrier being broken? Akatani nervously fidgets with his fingers. Akatani can feel Naomesa's eyes on him, the detective taking his eyes off the road momentarily to glance over at the boy. He had been kind enough not to stick Akatani in the back, allowing him to sit up front in the passenger seat. Something about the equal sitting up front is an assurance that this isn't an arrest. Yes. A group of villains broke into the USJ during a class trip there. Akatani stops fiddling with his hands and lifts his head to return the detective's gaze upon hearing that. But Naomesa has already returned his attention to the road, saying the rest, the barrier was a distraction for them to steal a schedule. Naomesa's grip on the steering wheel tightens. Aizawa's theory was right all along. You two were right to think something was suspicious. Akatani can sense the frustration coming from the man. Radiating in wafts of smell through his sweat, the ghoul picks up on Naomesa's feelings through more than just his words. You couldn't have known for sure. Don't blame yourself. Akatani tries consoling the detective as best as he can without touching him. He's not up to a hug or anything, and he doubts Naomesa is either. Especially considering they're in the middle of driving right now. But he does want to try to be of some consolation. He can tell that the detective is genuinely trying his best. Naomesa huffs, not really valuing the boy's words. He does appreciate the gesture though. Thanks, kid, offering a small smile in return. Akatani can tell that it's fake, having utilized false faces before himself, but he doesn't say anything more. When the unlikely duo finally reaches U.A, Naomesa leads Akatani to the med bay. Not the nurse's office. Where he's at is a room not likely meant for students. One reserved for overnight patients, with more severe or critical cases. Like Eraserhead. When Akatani sees Aizawa, he's not even sure that the man is the underground hero at first. So many bandages wrap Aizawa head to toe that his face is practically concealed in gauze. Akatani's fingers curl into his palm, nails cutting into the skin of his hand that's now clenched as a fist. Who did this to you? He can't suppress the shaking in his voice as well as he can the tremors of his body. Luckily, the detective and the underground hero mistaken the reason as worry and not rage. Naomesa sees Aizawa struggling to speak, so he hands the teacher a glass of water while answering for him. They called themselves the League of Villains. Akatani's not sure if the next bit is a jab at him or if it's meant to be a joke, friends of yours, but he takes the question rather personally of an insult. Can't say they are. The venom in his tone has Naomesa swallowing at the same time Aizawa takes a sip of water. Akatani then momentarily redirects his attention, noticing a certain absence in the room. His head swivels left and right as he scours the area before asking, "Where's Eri?" Having wetted his vocal cords, Aizawa takes the chance to answer that one. Don't worry, she was here at the teacher's lounge with all might. Akatani's heart beats quicker at the mention of the number one hero. She was nowhere near the attack. Hearing Eri was under the care of the world's strongest hero puts Akatani at ease, but he quickly recovers from his starstruck stupor to emphasize, "Where is she now though?" With Hizashi, Aizawa pauses when he realizes his mistake before correcting himself, I mean present Mike. Akatani inwardly beams at the mention of another hero, but doesn't let himself outwardly show any signs of excitement. Aizawa takes the stoic disposition as a sign of skepticism. Don't worry. Mike is a close friend of mine. He can be trusted with her. Aizawa purposefully doesn't mention Namuri's involvement though. He's not sure how the ghoul would react to his little sister being watched by an R-rated heroine. Not that Namuri would influence a girl Eri's age. Akatani allows himself to relax a little bit at that, knowing that Eri is safe. He suddenly feels like a storm drain, the downpour outside knocking him down into a cushioned seat at Aizawa's bedside. Kid, the wounded hero grunts when he tries to sit up. Naomesa also moves with a concerned demeanor. But Akatani waves them both off, dismissing their worries. Thank you. He can tell that Aizawa is making a confused expression by the way the bandages around his face crease and fold, so he elaborates, for not bringing her to the USJ. He's not sure what he would have done if Eri were harmed. Or worse. For what it's worth. I'm glad that I didn't either. Aizawa rests his eyes by closing them. His body sinks back into the cushioning of the hospital bed's mattress. He seems just as relieved. Akatani then realizes just how exhausted each and every one of them truly are. Naomesa slumps into a chair on the opposite side of Akatani and Aizawa, almost defeated in tune. They both look like they've taken a beating. Akatani supposes Aizawa has in a literal sense. These are the two that he entrusted to Eri. It's not that he doesn't see they clearly tried, but Akatani starts to regret his decision. He regrets decreasing his activity as the ghoul. Maybe he would have noticed the significant decrease in villain activity leading up to a league of them. He could have potentially seen the attack on USJ coming and maybe he would have participated in it. Akatani rests his head in his hands, the thought weighing heavily on him. He wonders if he actually would have been a part of the villain attack had Eraserhead not found him. Not with Eri. He knows that if he hadn't handed her over to them, then he wouldn't have gotten involved with villains. He wonders if he would have become one without her though. He wonders what kind of path that he was on before. Naomasa called him a vigilante but Toga had called him a villain. According to society, there isn't very much of a difference between the two categories. If all he wants is to help himself to a huge meal like the Yakuza, then an entire class of students wouldn't have been a bad place to pick up from where he left off. Akatani shakes his head, letting his hands fall from his face. He knows that he's not thinking rationally. That he's just hungry. It's his ghoulish cravings talking, not him. When he begins to starve, he doesn't care who it is that he devours, he'll just eat. Like when he ate his mother. He knows that if he hadn't met Aizawa, he would have just stuck to eating villains. Maybe the League would have been victims to the ghoul long before the attack on USJ could have taken place. Kid, Aizawa's voice sounds distant. So far away that it's barely worth calling a whisper. Kid, but the repetition is a little louder that time. It's enough to pull Akatani from the depths of his thoughts so that he doesn't drown in the ocean that the storm outside had made. When he breaks the surface, he gasps for air. He sees Aizawa and Naomasa staring at him expectantly. For what, he doesn't know. His breath hitches and he shivers from the cold that seems to have worked its way inside. I asked if you're hungry, he certainly wasn't expecting to hear that. Aizawa's tone is as soft as his bloodshot eyes though. It's not accusatory. It's not harsh or reprimanding. The underground hero is genuinely asking out of concern. Akatani's stomach growls in response, making him blush. He's not sure what gave him away before his body betrayed him, but he nods in embarrassed admittance. Yeah, but you're in no condition to. He tries denying the offer anyways since he knows the process is strenuating for the hero. There's some leftovers from the cafeteria that you can have. Naomasa can get it for you, but Aizawa is quick to cut Akatani off. Sure, Naomasa nods before pushing off with his knees to stand up. Sit tight while I get you some grub, kid. His overcoat gets discarded, hung over the chair's back to dry, before he heads for the sliding door. Akatani is about to make another attempt of refusal, but he doesn't have to when the nurse makes her entry from the other side of the door. He recognizes her as Recovery Girl, a short older lady who uses a cane to hobble in. What's this I hear about using your quirk? Naomasa is amazed by the woman's acute skill of deduction considering they didn't mention Aizawa's quirk per se. The way that the elder heroine uses her cane as a third leg makes Akatani view her as a wounded animal, the limp mimicking the loss of a fourth limb. Despite her mild handicap, she still manages to close the distance between the entrance and Aizawa's bed rather quickly. Didn't I tell you that you received damage to your eyes? Her tiny head shakes in disapproval as she starts to remove the gauze around his face. I haven't even changed your bandages yet. When Akatani sees the gnarly cut beneath the underground hero's right eye, he can't withhold a gasp. It's still healing, but it's sure to leave a permanent deep scar. For someone whose quirk relies on sight to function, the time of usage will no doubt diminish. It's not as bad as it looks, kid, Aizawa tries assuring the boy, but his nurse wears an expression that says otherwise. Now is a critical time to be healing. It's best if you don't use your quirk for a few weeks, at the very least. Recovery Girl gives her doctor's orders while applying a fresh clean set of bandages to hide the gash. But Aizawa isn't persuaded. The boy can only eat if, he tries explaining Akatani's situation in defense of the situation. But Akatani is quick to cut him off. It's okay. The outburst draws everybody's attention, making Akatani recoil and shrink in on himself. Knowing Eraserhead's health is on the line though, he can't allow himself to back down. I'm not hungry, so he lies. Are you sure? You shouldn't go weeks without eating. Aizawa's bandages crease with concern. And despite Recovery Girl's care for her patient, she too shares that same sentiment. Akatani stands up, nodding a little more forcefully than necessary, attempting to come across as confident. I've done it before. He turns to hide his face from them, forgetting that Naomasa is on the other side when he says the rest. I would try not to eat for as long as I could. Akatani's eyes widen when he sees the detective staring at him in bewilderment. Whatever Naomasa saw, Akatani ducks his head down to cover up. The boy slides his hands into his pockets, not wanting to fidget with them or ball them into fists. He feels in his pants the familiar leather mask of his ghoul persona. The thought of hunting on a rainy night is so alluring that he salivates a little. So long as you continue to keep that restraint, then there's nothing to worry about. Naomesa's voice draws his gaze back up. The detective is wearing a stern expression, but his eyes appear so trusting that it hurts to look into them for too long. Akatani averts his gaze. He's been given a chance he doesn't deserve. They're willing to trust him, to rehabilitate him. And he's about to throw that all away. To be fair, they'd only been fooling themselves. They were on borrowed time before Aizawa's accident. Who they had been kidding, Akatani doesn't know. All he does know is that their way didn't work. He'd tried. He really did. But what he's done and what he's about to do is his fundamental nature. The ghoul vows right then and there to find the one responsible for harming Aizawa, and to satisfy his hunger that way. You're going to be fine. Right? Aizawa asks from behind him. Akatani turns around to face the hero, beaming the brightest smile he can muster, teeth and all. Yeah, he enthusiastically lies again. The clatter of tin against glass follows a canned coffee down into the disposable at the bottom of the vending machine. Akatani reaches in and takes the beverage, popping the lid open with a flick of his thumb. He was surprised that he didn't find Shinso loitering by the machine. Then again, he was very much relieved as well. He didn't come to the Quirk support group meeting place for idle chit-chat this time. Akatani, a blonde blur, rams into the boy all too suddenly. He nearly drops his drink, startled from his very brief thoughts. When he sees that it's the girl he called to meet him, he relaxes a little. Hey Himiko, his eyes shift from her to another presence. A guy with patches of gnarled and wrinkled skin covering much of his face and neck looks about the place with disinterest. Who's your friend? Akatani feels the need to ask. The obvious burn victim turns his gaze to meet Akatani's, eyes drooping in boredom as he introduces himself, Dabi. Akatani can't help but raise a brow at the name. Dabi just raises a brow right back. You texted me saying you wanted me to introduce you to more of my friends. Himiko finally detaches herself from Akatani to present Dabi with a mild flourish, so I thought I'd just bring one along. Akatani's eyes widen momentarily, remembering that he did indeed do that. Oh, he steps forward to introduce himself in return, bowing at the waist to be respectful. Sorry for being rude. I'm Akatani Mikumo. Dabi doesn't seem fazed in the slightest. He's back to inspecting his surroundings, searching for something amongst the nothing. So, Quirk counseling. His drawl is as impassive as he looks. He doesn't seem impressed by Akatani nor the location. Not exactly. The boy chuckles awkwardly as he returns to standing up straight. Trying to think of a way to break the ice, he winds up scratching the back of his head. Feeling his hair course through his fingers, Akatani perks up, finding something to say. What brand hair dye did you use? He nods his head in indication to Dabi's black pointed hair. Dabi falters, taken aback by the question. His shock quickly turns into something else, eyes narrowing. At least Akatani has his attention now. How did you? Akatani points to his own hair, takes one to know one. Which earns a shock from Himiko next. The blonde bounces back over to the boy, leaning into his personal space. You dye your hair? Her yellow eyes glint in the light as she asks, what color is it normally? Akatani hesitates, unsure of whether or not he should answer. Then he remembers that this is Himiko. Even with Dabi listening in, he sighs and relents. Green, but his cheeks are bright red. Oh, I can picture that. Himiko plays with the boy's curly hair by twirling it around her fingers. She imagines the color matching the blood that's rushing to his face and how he'd be lit up like a Christmas tree, giggling to herself. When Himiko switches her sights to Dabi, she's expecting him to share his natural hair color as well. The boy covered in burn sighs, all the stress you give me made my hair turn white, so I had no choice but to dye it, but Akatani is relieved that he's capable of dry humor at the very least. Akatani laughs, agreeing wholeheartedly with Dabi. Do you think I could be her next victim? He asks in between guffaws. Himiko looks between the two boys before pouting, you two sure are getting along rather quickly, and crosses her arms under her bust. Yeah, well, Dabi turns his body away from them as though he's ready to leave, I'm not really the social butterfly. If it's a friend that you were wanting? Akatani suddenly remembers the reason that he called Himiko here and had asked her to introduce him to her friends. Oh. No, he winces when he realizes that came out wrong, I mean yes, but Dabi lingers in between Akatani and the exit, forcing Akatani to get to the point. I'm looking for, The boy just isn't sure how to word it. You wouldn't happen to be a part of a league, would you? Dabi looks more confused than he did previously. A league? Responding quizzically. Akatani shakes his head, never mind, before turning back to Himiko. I just thought because of Yuta and his connection to the Yakuza, that maybe you'd know where I could find. He realizes that he should have been more direct with her a little too late. Sighing to himself, he tries to explain, there's some bad people I'm looking for and... He trails off when he sees the expression of hurt in Himiko's face. He realizes how much smaller she is than him when he hears her soft whimper, you associate me with bad? No, Akatani blurts out in an initial panic. He fumbles over himself as much as his words, not knowing whether he should say something or hug her. Dabi makes a strange noise from behind him before he gets the chance to apologize. When Akatani turns to see what the weird sound was about, he sees Dabi's non-scarred skin is rather pale. And that the burned boy's blue eyes are fixated on a newcomer. Shoto Todoroki approaches them from the opposite direction. Mikumo, Todoroki nods in greeting to the boy that he recognizes before glancing between Himiko and Dabi. Who are your friends? Todoroki. Akatani feels sweat beating down his forehead as he's surrounded by the bunch of familiar faces. The only way this situation could possibly get worse is if Shinso suddenly materialized out of thin air to join them. He swallows, trying to get the right words to come out of his throat, but nothing coming up. His head swivels back to Himiko first. The blonde has hidden her hurt, faking a smile as she waves to Todoroki. Himiko Toga, her introduction is briefer than usual, but Akatani is admittedly relieved that's the case. Are you Akatani's friend? Yes. Todoroki doesn't sound very sure of that answer, but Akatani passes it off as part of the tension in the awkward situation. After all, Dabi isn't paying Todoroki any mind. He's been frozen in place, pale flesh tone making Akatani believe he really could have succumbed to frostbite. Todoroki returns his attention to Akatani, mutually ignoring the other boy. I actually came to offer you a gift, Mikumo. Akatani raises both of his eyebrows at that surprise. A gift? When Todoroki hands him the present, he isn't expecting 2 pink slips. For you and Eri. Todoroki's elaboration doesn't do much to actually explain anything until Akatani reads what's written on the paper in his hand. Tickets to U.A Sports Festival? The boy can't help but feel some elation. He'd always seen the event aired on television, but never attended it in person before. However, his excitement is short-lived. He pauses when he realizes, wait. Eri, also confusing Todoroki. Oh. Shinso didn't tell you. Akatani's grip on the tickets tightens. He's not sure how many more surprises he can take right now. Tell me what? Todoroki's heterochromic eyes squint as he tries to make sense of the situation. Akatani glances at Himiko, not all that shocked to see her staring right back. She's the only one that knows the truth, but she knows better than to call him out if he lies. Despite what he said, he doesn't associate her with bad. He hopes that the trust they share will let her know that. Eri's father took her to America. She tilts her head but says nothing, visitation rights and all that. Your father? Todoroki's mood significantly darkens. Akatani swivels his head from Himiko back to him. He sees the dual-quirked boy's fists are clenched at his sides. Dabi, as distant as he was, picks up on the change in attitude as well. Remembering Todoroki's past with his own father, Akatani's eyes can't help but be drawn between the boy's scar and Dabi's burns. She's safe. She's perfectly fine, he tries to sound assuring before allowing himself to succumb to his sorrow. I just miss her is all. You know? Noticing the change in atmosphere, as well as everyone's demeanor, Todoroki also calms down. Yes, he has a sibling amongst his brothers and sister that he misses too. Even Dabi ducks his head in the back, relating in some way or another. Sensing somber moods, Himiko tries to salvage the situation by jumping in the middle. Can I have the extra ticket instead? Her bright and bubbly act pulls everyone out from their sulking states successfully. Please? I really want to go. Oh, sure. Akatani hopes that saying yes might help make up for upsetting her earlier. It must to some extent, since Himiko stands on her tippy toes to plant a kiss on his cheek. Yay! It's a date, she cheers while snatching the ticket that she's claimed for herself. Dabi rolls his eyes while watching the entire exchange. Having had enough, he turns his back to them. I'm leaving, and announces his exit. Himiko teasingly sticks her tongue out at him, even though he can't see it. Oh, don't be such a sour seagull, and doesn't seem all that bothered that she made him uncomfortable. Returning to his stoic self, Todoroki turns towards Akatani to say, "You have strange friends, Mikumo." Wanting to retort, Akatani opens his mouth. When he realizes that he can't, his shoulders sag and he sulks while admitting, "I know." There are so many smells wafting through the air. Concession stands selling hot dogs and other meats alongside vendors that mix caramel or churn cotton candy. It's enough to make any person salivate. Through all those different promising tastes, however, the scent that the ghoul amongst the crowd finds most alluring is that of a mouse scurrying about. The rodent feasts on all the unfinished snacks people leave behind, nibbling on the litter. The ghoul runs his tongue along his lips, adopting that idea. Where nobody will bother looking, Akatani takes a detour into an alley. The overstuffed trash cans and overloaded dumpster had drawn the mouse away from the crowded festival. Out of sight and in the dark during the day, Akatani stops for a quick bite. Literally. He sinks his teeth into the mouse, fangs digging into flesh so easily. The blood doesn't just seep from the screeching rat, it gushes out in a rush like a bursted balloon. As though it too couldn't wait to get in the ghoul's mouth. The taste is bitter. Not sweet like a human. Akatani almost spits it out. Yet, it's better than nothing. He doesn't know if he could withstand the festival if he doesn't take this precaution. When a little girl had fallen and scraped her knee, he could barely hold himself back. A small snack to hold him over to his next meal suddenly seemed like a good idea to him. If a mouse is the best he could find on such short notice, then it'll have to do. Once he's finished, he wipes the blood smeared across his mouth with his sleeve. It'd be easier to explain a red stain there instead of on his face if anybody asks. Though he doubts anybody will if even Himiko doesn't once he meets up with her. The blonde latches onto that same arm, wrapping both of her own around it and squeezing. The seats Todoroki had gotten them are pretty good. They're just shy of the front row, but that's good considering the placement of the bleachers and not having to worry about heads getting in the way. Himiko snuggles against Akatani's side, pushing his arm up and over her shoulders to wrap around. When the boy looks down at her with surprise, she feigns innocence with a smile that doesn't flash her fangs. Akatani blushes and looks away, but doesn't retract his arm. He's aware of how much they must look like a couple being so close together. Part of him wonders if they actually are. Having no experience with girls, he's not sure what their relationship status currently is. It's not like he can muster up the courage to ask her either. The two of them share moments where he thinks that she likes him just as much as he likes her, but he's too afraid to ruin their friendship. And considering Himiko's personality, he figures that's just the way she acts around everybody. He's grateful that the sports festival is beginning its first event, since that ought to take his mind off it. Classes are being called out onto the massive field where a wheel will decide how they'll compete. Akatani searches the crowd of hero hopefuls and other Udata students, looking for Todoroki or Shinso. Instead, he spots someone from his childhood. Absent-mindedly, Akatani pulls Himiko a little closer to him, his hand gripping her shoulder a bit harder than it should. The small smile on his face is partially forced, but he can't help but admit to admiring his old friend. Of course Kaken would get into UA. The boy had been gifted with a quirk suited for heroics and his tenacity makes him as equally perfect of a hero candidate. As a matter of fact, when the boy is called to the podium for having the highest score in U.A's practical exam, he declares that he's going to win the festival with sincere determination. Himiko notices Akatani's internal crisis from beside him. She takes his free hand in hers, hoping to pull him back to reality. Feeling her soft touch, he does get drawn to the girl. His eyes gaze into hers, green staring into yellow. The compromised emotional state each of them share are locked away and hidden behind those lenses. For a moment, they allow one another to catch a glimpse of that vehemence. Akatani swallows, his mouth dry. Himiko's eyes are so similar to a feline's that they can sometimes seem predatory. They remind him of his own from time to time. He forces himself to look away, returning his attention to the sports festival. He's content enough with her soft hand in his rough one. So long as she holds him in place here, he doesn't have to feel like being out in public is a risk. Or so he hopes. When he hears Aizawa's voice through the stadium speakers, that helps to sober him up as well. He wasn't expecting Eraserhead to be a part of this year's commentary with present Mike. He partially wonders if Eri is in the booth with them overlooking the show as well. He hopes so. He hopes she gets to enjoy the games and the performances from such a good view. Thinking of her and the underground hero makes him squeeze Himiko's hand. He has to stay grounded for all of their sakes. Losing control and letting himself loose here of all places wouldn't do any good. He sighs, slouching in his seat. Knowing how long the sports festival can be, he may as well get comfortable. Though the first tournament does go by rather quickly. That could have to do with the fact that it was a foot race through an obstacle course. The participants navigated through a terrain of massive robots and over a canyon before coming to a minefield. That's where Todoroki had a face-off with Kaken, each of them using their quirks to cross the grounds faster than the rest of the racers. It was quite the spectacle. The crowd cheered and awed over the close finish. Todoroki had taken first place and Kaken second, wowing even Akatani. He hadn't expected his childhood friend to be beaten. Kaken never lost as far as Akatani was concerned. He could hardly believe his eyes that he had to rub them and blink back a few tears. Maybe times had changed. Maybe Kaken isn't the same kid that he remembers. After all, even he had changed over the years they split apart. When an explosion goes off down in the arena below, Akatani takes it back. Kaken still has a short fuse to go along with his dynamite detonating quirk. Though coming in first place, in the end, worked against Todoroki. For the second challenge, remaining players were given headbands with points based on their race placements. The less time it took to cross the finish line, the higher the number. When it's announced that to win the second round, participants must capture other people's headbands to earn the most points, Todoroki practically has a target over his head. Akatani winces, sympathizing with his friend. He doesn't envy being in that predicament, but does partially wish he could help somehow. The second round is a cavalry battle where players must partner with each other to make groups of 4. So at least Todoroki isn't alone. Akatani is relieved to see Shinso joining the team at the very least. Some pink-haired girl with a bunch of gadgets also willingly comes over to offer her services. Akatani had been worried that Todoroki would have trouble convincing people to work with him, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The game ought to go on to be an interesting one. All the teams rush Todoroki at once. Todoroki throws up an ice wall to shield he and his team long enough to fly away with a jetpack, shocking the audience. What doesn't surprise Akatani, however, is Kaken finding a way to pursue the dual-quirked boy even when airborne. Kaken uses his explosions to fly after Todoroki, creating an aerial battle. Akatani leans forward, engrossed by the competition he's witnessing. Shinso says something that gets Kaken to respond. Then, the Insomniac's quirk takes effect. Kaken freezes up and falls out of the sky like a plane that's run out of fuel. Akatani momentarily worries that his childhood friend is going to lose, or get hurt, but relaxes when the blonde's team catches him. It was a close call. Close enough that Kaken doesn't try it again. Unfortunately for Todoroki, his jetpack actually does run out of fuel. He and his team are forced to land. As soon as he does, all teams converge on him all over again. He tries freezing them all in place, but that only delays them briefly. He's forced to rely on the teammate he had joined him at the last minute. The tall blue-haired boy with glasses who has engines in his calves reveals a trump card. Those leg thrusters rev to their maximum potential before launching the team like a rocket. They cross the field to the opposite side in a matter of seconds, buying them some more time. It seems Todoroki's strategy is stalling for as long as he can. Though Akatani isn't sure for how much longer his friend will be able to keep that up. There are just too many opponents surrounding him with too long of a countdown to the end. Especially since Kaken is one of those competitors, blasting towards him at max speed. The blonde reaches for the headband, about to snatch it away. And then, Todoroki's left side ignites with flames. Kaken instinctively retracts his hand, avoiding the fire. And then redirects himself with his explosions to prevent crashing into the ground. Todoroki's flames recede just as quickly as they had appeared. The brief exchange has both of them shaken and Akatani even more invested in their match. He's not sure who to root for or what to expect from either of them anymore. Just at the height of the competition, the timer hits 0 and the buzzer sounds, indicating that the round is over. Akatani lets out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A much-needed intermission begins, allowing Akatani to excuse himself. He goes to the bathroom to splash some water on his face, to regain control of his senses, to do something to keep himself under control. It's becoming increasingly difficult to regulate his instincts. So when he catches a whiff of blood, he nearly loses himself. His nostrils flare and he staggers back from the rush of adrenaline that hits him like a wave. Akatani's hand catches the doorframe, crushing the cement as he squeezes it like a stress ball. Akatani's vision blurs despite the enhancement that his Kakugan grants him. He covers his exposed eye with the hand that had been clutching the doorway. When he lifts his head, he sees the source of blood exposure. A familiar skeletally skinny blonde coughs into a napkin. It takes a moment for Akatani to remember. The man was a customer at Antiku. He must be sick. The boy swallows the saliva that's been accumulating in his mouth. The unhealthy blonde drops his napkin into the trash disposal before walking towards the exit. Akatani nearly trips over himself as he tries to get out of the way. The man is polite as he passes by. "Excuse me, young man," unaware of the ghoul's desire to feed. Akatani wants to respond, to warn the man, but he's too afraid of what'll happen if he opens his mouth. He doubts such a sick person would be able to defend themselves if he loses control. A much younger blonde suddenly comes along to tend to the ill elder. The healthier human pauses when he spots Akatani, voice catching in his throat. "Are you all right?" He pays the boy no mind and returns his attention to the man who had been coughing up blood. Akatani internally wonders if they're related. Perhaps the older blonde is the younger one's father or grandfather, he figures. The Friley father figure places a comforting hand on the fellow blonde's much sturdier shoulder. "I'm fine, young Togata." But Togata doesn't seem all that convinced. He reluctantly turns around to head back up to the bleachers. "If you say so." Akatani backs into the bathroom, watching them leave. He's extremely aware of his heartbeat, and all the blood pumping through his veins to make it pound so hard. That was too close of a call. More than he knows. He nearly vomits from the amount of anxiety, but only coughs up some spittle. He's disgusted with himself. Disgusted that he nearly devoured such a defenseless man. Disgusted that he dug into the trash disposal to recover the blood-stained napkin. And that's it for today. Please like and subscribe for more. See you in the next part.